Poland and increasingly now in the rest of the European Union countries where we operate, the tone has changed massively in 5 years. I mean, it is night and day, to be frank. And what's driving that is it's a combination of things. It's renewables getting really, really cheap. Second thing is that carbon has got expensive in the EU. Third is that you've got a body of EU legislation which embeds really challenging targets. And then you've got popular sentiment, more and more people concerned about the environment, pushing that agenda. And then you've got business. And we see this outside the EU, company after company saying, I'm not waiting for government. I want to go green.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today leads the lending and investment team at one of Europe's most influential renewables financiers. He focuses exclusively, I believe, on deploying capital investments in the places where investment is hard, like Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, rather than where it's easy. He cut his teeth in the investment space as a lawyer at one of the world's best known firms, and he's unusually a classicist by training with a first-class honours degree in classics from the University of Oxford. My guest on the show today is Harry Boyd-Carpenter, Director, Head of Energy, EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome on the show, Harry.
Hi, John. Thanks very much.
And we've done something special today, and we're also having an Aurora expert to join us. So some will be surprised to hear Aurora actually has a bit of multilateral banking experience in-house. Most of it is actually on this call and embodied in our internal Aurora guest, Peter Baum. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, John.
And as I say, Peter is Aurora's resident multilateral banker. He's formerly of the Ebrd. He's now a project leader in Aurora's Berlin office, focusing on our activities in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. But he'll shortly be heading to Papua New Guinea to head up the Asian Development Bank's lending in that country. So exciting times ahead for Peter in the multilateral banking space. Great. So, Harry, can I start by touching on the route you took to get to the role that you're in now? So one thing that strikes me about your background is, so you're a Magic Circle lawyer. It seems to me, if you're a Magic Circle lawyer and you don't stay a Magic Circle lawyer and you move into the finance sector or something else, most people tend to move into the private sector. What was it that drew you into multilateral development investing, that type of area?
It was really two things. One is just the sense of what are you trying to get out of a job, and I'm not somebody who thinks that you can only change the world by going into multilateral. Quite the contrary. I mean, Ebrd is a bank that believes in the power of a private sector to deliver good things for people. But in my particular case, I was just interested in the breadth of challenges and the type of challenges that a public institution has to engage with. And, part of my career, while I've been working in Analyst, I left for a year and went to work in Kosovo shortly after the war there in the late 90s. And that had really exposed me to that sort of work. And I think, what really came out of it was just two things. One is how fascinating I found those countries. There's just something really, really, really interesting about emerging markets. Peter's about to find this out in spades, but there's just a dynamism and an opportunity, an excitement about those sort of countries, and then also just the breadth of challenges you get to engage with at a public institution. You have to think about political challenges, economic challenges, technical, engineering, commercial. So it was those two things: the excitement of the countries and the breadth of the challenge to engage with.
Interesting, and I'd like to pick up on the topic of, in what circumstances can the private sector thrive and contribute to social welfare, and in what circumstances is that problematic, like flogging a dead horse where you don't have the enablers there. We'll pick that up later, hopefully. The other thing about your background I wanted to pick up, so classics, it seems like an unusual journey, although in this country, the UK where we're recording, it seems like there are classicists everywhere in the city of London. How did that prepare you? And by classics, I mean classical languages, classical civilizations and their history. How did that prepare you for the career you took? Or maybe it didn't.
Yeah, well, we've got a classicist in number 10, don't forget, as well. But I can detect the sort of, the Australian quant thinking, what is this nonsense? But no, I mean, the proposition is, I didn't study classics because I wanted to teach classics or whatever. I'm married to somebody who teaches classics, and I can see, she's a hell of a lot better at it than I am. But the proposition, for people who like me who chose that route, was that it's a fantastic training, that it gives you an intellectual toolkit that allows you then to engage with a whole range of challenges. And it's not for me to judge probably, but I actually think in my experience that really has been borne out. It's a rigorous course. You have to engage with language. You have to engage with two very structured languages, that follow a whole load of rules. I mean, it's doing Latin and Greek translation is a bit like code breaking. So it gives you, I think, that rigor and that discipline and that understanding of how language works. But then you have to do history, you have to do philosophy, and that gives you an ability, I hope, to assimilate a lot of information, synthesize it, and then put something down on paper that's reasonably credible. And the other thing, of course, is it gives you the long view. When you're dealing with things, it helps to be able to sort of remember that, Aristotle didn't give a damn about any of your problems, and gives you a bit of a sense of perspective.
Do you find yourself drawing parallels? You think, the arc of civilizations to topics like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and these. Do you see parallels between the world today and the classical world, or was it more about the practical skills of actually, studying, doing classics rather than the actual knowledge?
It's more the skill set. I mean, I think there's an interest. There's always an interest. I mean, sometimes it's quite refreshing when you're sort of stressed and sort of worrying about the immediacy of the challenges. It's quite refreshing to sort of sit back and think about some of the things. The Iliad is the Iliad and will still be an amazing work of art in another 2,000 years. And that helps you sort of calm down a bit sometimes. But no, I mean, the practical things I learned, it's interesting, actually. There is an growing area of study within classics looking at, the classical world's engagement with climate and engagement with landscape. But the truth is, climate change was not a problem then, and there wasn't the scientific sort of way of thinking to engage with it in the same way. So no, it's the skill set that's really useful. At least I hope it's useful.
Got it. Interesting. An interesting take. Just looking to the future of your career, actually. So I don't know, you have a new title, or you will have a new title very soon. You will. Managing Director for Green Economy and Climate Action. Now, I imagine that's the first time that title has existed in the EBRD. How does it change your focus?
Well, so it's the first time that title exists, but it's the renaming of an existing title. So we had a managing director for energy efficiency and climate change, who is a guy called Josue Tanaka, who retired at the end of last year. But he's a towering figure. I mean, not just in EBRD, but just generally in the climate world. I mean, he's really the person who defined, I think, what EBRD and by extension other multilateral development banks should be doing in this space. So, the role exists already, and it's a pretty hard act to follow, to put it mildly. But the job is essentially to look across. It's a step back from direct engagement in transactions and policy dialogue, or certainly transactions. So it's not a directly deal doing role, but it's to be part of a team that looks across the whole economy and all of EBRD's activities and tries to do a couple of things. One is to inform all of those activities with an understanding of where the climate debate is going. What does economy-wide decarbonization look like? And the other is to really make sure that we, as a bank, we can tend to think, bankers tend to think very narrowly, very focused. Let's get my project done. Let's move my client's deal forward, and to try to make sure that we think holistically about the problem. And I think, that to me is becoming more and more obvious that, in the past, in my sector, in the energy sector, we used to think, okay, how do we get this first 20 megawatt wind farm to happen in a country or whatever? Now you've really got to think about the whole picture and say, okay, how do we integrate electricity with transport? How do we think about heating, those sorts of things? So that's really that role, to try to look holistically across the whole economy, across the whole bank, and make sure that the whole picture fits together.
Yeah. So it sounds phenomenally relevant, as you say. You know, it is. It is. I suppose the premise behind your answer is it's less obvious now where intervention from someone like the EBRD can have the biggest impact, and some more thought about that is relevant, I suppose. Now that a lot of these low carbon technologies are quite mature.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think, you know, we'd like to think we can continue to find places to have impact, but you've got to keep evolving. You know, in the past, we would have been just, you know, celebrating if we'd managed to do a 10 megawatt solar plant somewhere. Now, I mean, there are still a few countries where we'd regard that as groundbreaking, but not many left.
Yeah, they do themselves now, really.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to keep, you know, the point of a bank like EBRD, I mean, it depends a little bit which country you're in, but, you know, in many countries, the point is not to do the simple standardized thing, because then we're crowding out the private sector. You know, we're not bringing value added. So, you know, we've got to be constantly looking at the frontier, and the frontier is, you know, there are quite a lot of frontiers. You know, one I think is going to be around greening the financial system, so embedding a sort of systemic approach to sustainability in finance, so that, you know, you start to have a natural bias in financial flows towards what's green and what's sustainable. Another is about new technologies, and then another is just about new business models. You know, finding you know, so in some countries, you know, where we would in the past have said, let's do project finance debt for a wind farm, that's the thing to do. Now that's, you know, that's all taken care of. We have to think about equity, or we have to think about green bonds, or, you know, something that hasn't been done yet.
So on that first of those 3 points, a slight, potentially naive question around sort of greening of finance. How big a role do you think the EBRD can have in sort of, you know, standardization of contractual terms or capital structure, whatever it is, in going in and saying, this is how you should do this, or this is what an ESG linked bond looks like? Has that been part of the EBRD's legacy?
Yeah, well, we're not yet talking about legacy yet. But
no. I'm sure the best days are still ahead. But,
exactly.
But,
yeah, onwards and upwards.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a question about, you know, when is the EBRD's job done, which I think you've got later on in the program. But no, I mean, I think one of the things I say about EBRD, and be interested to know Peter's take on it, having been there, but now being an objective observer, is, you know, we are really close to projects, to clients, to governments. You know, we have very strong local presence. We're a project-driven bank, and I think what makes us when we are at our best and most effective when we're responding to those local opportunities and local needs. So, you know, what we did in Mongolia to open up renewables there is different to what we are doing in Greece, say, or in the Baltics. So there's no single overarching answer, but I do think, you know, if you look at trying to green the financial system, you know, we're an important participant in some of the working groups at the industry level trying to shape that. And then very often what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure we're always really interested in doing the first project of a particular type. So the first green bond or the first sustainability linked bond. And that gives you the chance to set the standard. Yeah. And one of the questions we always ask ourselves, for example, for the first renewables project is, okay, is this structure not just enough to get this project done, but is this a structure you can scale?
Yeah.
You know, you don't, there's nothing exciting about doing the first 50 megawatt project unless you know that you can repeat this to 500 megawatts or, you know, 2000 megawatts.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter?
This is a really interesting element of EBRD's work, that we've been working together in Poland, for example, where EBRD is the lead lender in many of, let's say, market-driven renewable or wind farms. And then you have other co-lenders coming in, and presumably in a couple of years' time, they do that by themselves. And that's just an established model. Yeah. And I think that dynamic, if you see that, that's really interesting and fascinating about, I think, the work that EBRD is doing with the private sector directly.
And Harry, on this new role, how does it evolve, given your major shareholders, obviously UK, EU, but also the Biden administration. How does the changing administration in the US impact your focus on sort of climate and the wider energy transition?
Well, it accentuates it and it strengthens it. And the US is, a very important shareholder. I mean, it's an important shareholder. Firstly, in crude terms, it's our largest shareholder, but also, the US is a global leader in so many ways. But it is still just one shareholder amongst many. And I think, it's also important, EBRD is an independent financial institution. We're not part of the European Union architecture, but at the same time, European Union member states, together with the Commission and the EIB, make up a majority of our shareholders. So it's an enormously influential shareholder bloc. And, it says in the preamble to our establishing agreement that we're fundamentally European in character. So American influence is really important. But it's not overwhelming. It's not determinative. I think what really helps is the alignment now of major shareholders, and that's not just true for us. It's true across the world. I mean, if you now look and say, well, you have the EU and people close to the EU, the countries like Norway, countries like the UK, clearly committed to net zero by 2050. You have China committed to net zero by 2060. You have the US, Biden administration committing to net zero by 2050. You just get this sort of groundswell of momentum, which didn't exist, prior to the change in administration.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And do you get this? I mean, and again, without knowing how the funding model, but it's sort of, do you think more capital will be seeking to be deployed from your shareholders through the EBRD, or?
No, there's not a discussion about a capital increase for EBRD. I mean, that may come in if circumstances change, but I think we're very well capitalized right now. I think we have the capital to do what we want. I mean, we're constantly looking at new tools, but I think in terms of us deploying more capital, it will be more about mobilization than just raising more money from our shareholders, and that's the right way to go. I mean, if to the extent that we need more capital, what we really need to be doing is creating structures that crowd in the private sector, not raising yet more public money. Yeah.
It's interesting. The thing I find most striking about Biden's climate commitments is this net zero grid by 2035.
Yeah.
And you could argue that he's actually ahead of Europe now. In the space of a few months, the US energy policy is going to go onto the forefront. Now let's see what follows, but it's very interesting.
No, I agree. That's an extraordinary commitment, and interestingly, I mean, you mentioned I worked at Analyst. I mean, Analyst is just, I got a note saying they'd strengthen their renewables practice in the US, and I thought, absolutely. I mean, the business opportunity that's coming there, because when you start to look at the numbers, my only worry is, how do I keep investors interested in some of my markets when they see what, imagine you guys might be upping sticks and saying we better move to the US. That's where all the business is going to be.
Yeah. Well, we're now set up in Austin, and it's a good time, but the challenge. I mean, it almost feels too audacious to me, I suppose, would be one of my concerns. And then, as you probably know, US policy of tax credits is not actually, it's not great at crowding in private sector investment. Actually, it's pretty good at keeping a whole bunch of private sector investment out from certain people. Anyway, that's a topic for a different podcast, I suspect. Can I ask you both so I want to change topics and talk a little bit about just development banking, multilateral banking in general. And I suppose the most fundamental question for me is, why do organizations like the EBRD, European Investment Bank, Green Investment Bank, Australia's CEFC, why do they have a role to play in the energy transition? And I suppose history, certainly when the EBRD was established, I don't think anyone would have envisaged, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone would have necessarily envisaged that sort of role for it. So why, and in general, at least my view is you've got to be very careful in intervening in the private markets. You're going to make sure you're fixing something, right? Why do they exist, and why do they have an important role to play? Maybe Harry first.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, in Peter's previous role in EBRD, part of his job was to be part of a team that asked exactly that question internally. Look, hang on a minute, do you really have a role here? And there's always a tension because, you see deals, you're excited by opportunities, excited by projects, and you need mechanisms, you need structures within the bank that ensure that you don't crowd people out and you do keep focused. So, of course, I mean, I work there. I think there is an important role, and I think that role comes from a number of things, generally about multilaterals, and then specifically about EBRD. So, generally in multilaterals, I think, we have a mandate to take a long view and to take political risks. And it's quite hard to imagine an energy transition taking place if you don't have some investors with a long view and a mandate to take political risks. Because it's a very long-lived sector, fundamentally driven by politics. So I think that there's value in having that. I think there is value in having an entity that has a mandate to sit on that line between the public and the private. We're a bank that's fundamentally about the private sector. 75% of our investment goes to the private sector. We have a private sector culture and ethos, and we have a clear mandate to stay focused there. At the same time, we're publicly owned, and we have a credibility with the public sector that is quite unusual, because fundamentally they know that we're on their side. And that ability to sort of navigate that road, to bring the two together. And if I think about some of the most impactful, most exciting projects we've done, it's when we've been able to do that, to bring the public to the private sector together. And then, specifically about EBRD, I mean, EBRD has a mandate around transition to sustainable markets or free markets. And if you accept the proposition that, climate change in particular is a market failure, a bank that has a mandate to fix markets and to promote markets is quite well placed to meet that challenge. That said, I mean, there's always a risk of mission creep. There's always a risk of crowding out. I think what helps with EBRD is, partly some of the internal structures, people, with a job to raise that challenge, but also that we operate on commercial principles. Our credit function looks like a commercial bank credit function. You go in there and you can say all you like to the credit officer that this project's going to save the world, and it will make it will be populated by happy smiling children, and daffodils will grow amongst the wind turbines. They could not care less. They just say to you, is it going to pay? Is it going to pay back? Are we going to do that? And I think, and also pricing, they put the pressure on us to price the deals properly. And I think that constraint is probably the most important one, because it puts you in a situation where you're acting commercially, and therefore people will only come to you if there's no commercial alternative, no private commercial alternative. Anyway, Peter will probably tell you all the real reasons. He'll probably tell you you're right, and that's why he left, and it should close. We should be closed tomorrow. But.
Yeah, only in Papua New Guinea is there a role.
Yeah.
And Peter, it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that. And if I could just kind of sharpen up my question a bit, feel free to answer, the broader question of why they've got a role to play in the energy transition. I mean, a cynic might say, right, these institutions exist because government wants to be able to pick winners, wants to avoid the political blowback that's associated with that. So it's a tighter hand than a carbon price or something else like that. And it's kind of plausible deniability in terms of what they're doing. It's far enough removed that I'm not going to get hit for this. And so that the question, obviously, that would be the totally cynical view. But I suppose one question here is it possible to remove the politics from investment decisions? So I get it, there's a credit, and maybe the credit team is the answer to that question. What's the role, and is it actually, all of these great things, long-term planning, fixing market failures that Harry touched on, is it possible to remove the politics from the investment decision?
I mean, the answer is probably not entirely, but interestingly, when we think about it, infrastructure development going decades back, if it's just a state-driven exercise, a state-driven responsibility, that's one thing. I think we're now looking at, or we're understanding that public capital cannot solve the issues and challenges that we have. If we're thinking of here, development banks or public lenders can play a role in the sense that you don't have one definite answer, but you're helping different answers to grow and succeed. An example in the German context, I mean, where we have a very strong state-driven, government-driven energy transition with subsidies, etc., is the offshore business there, where in the beginning, the public lender, KfW, took on more debt share to kind of de-risk these projects. They still had to work by themselves. They still had to repay, but the government said, we take this technology risk in the beginning. And if you now look at it across Europe, I mean, offshore is a business model that works very well. And in Germany, I mean, there's no public lender involved anymore or needed.
Yeah. And do you're going to PNG, you're going to do lending there. Is that in your sort of your conscience, right? Like, how much good am I doing for the world? Is it an easier kind of bar in PNG in terms of the role of a multilateral institution than it is in, say, Greece? Do you feel like the opportunity is bigger, or is it just different? You know, are you less likely to crowd out in PNG than you are in Greece or something like that?
I mean, absolutely. When we're talking about crowding out, absolutely no question. But I think it's also different challenges, right? Different challenges. The nature in PNG, it's not only about the energy transition, but there are a lot of other competing, let's say, development challenges of focal areas. And on the other hand, I mean, we're talking about crowding out, but in a place like PNG, the question about bringing in private sector capital, making them feel comfortable, but also benefiting from or bringing in private sector know-how. So I think there's a bit of a different dynamic.
Yeah. Okay. Could I change tack a bit, Harry, and talk about the so EBRD? We've talked about it. I think we all agree there's a big role to play in the energy transition. Markets aren't perfect. Long-term thinking is useful. All of those types of things. Can you say a bit about the complementary aspects of energy and energy markets that help you do your job? What are the types of environments that enable private sector investment? The sort of thing that comes to mind is, it seems to me like there's a lot of activity in, as we say, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, relatively less in Hungary at the moment, which I assume is political. But what are the kind of key ingredients that make your job of attracting private sector investment into a particular market easier?
I think it's a couple of things. I mean, number one is prices. And if you get the prices right, everything flows from that. And the biggest example for me is the EU carbon allowance price. To see what's happened in that in the last couple of years. I mean, you guys are all over it, but it makes a discussion with a credit officer so much easier, because you're basically, I mean, the way I put it, if you do a renewables project, you're providing the commodity that everybody wants without the pollution that nobody wants. So you've got a product that there is going to be demand for, and you can point and say, look, the competitor, if you take Poland, for example, in crude numbers, let's say EU allowance is now 40 euros a ton. A megawatt hour of coal-fired power is around about a ton of carbon. People can bid renewable projects in auctions at 40 euros a megawatt hour. So instantly you just know you're in the money.
Coal could be free and it would still not compete.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really hard to get away from that very compelling logic. So in other markets are not, outside the EU, you still don't have a meaningful carbon price. But again, when you look at energy prices, I've done quite a lot of work in North Africa. And if you stripped away all the subsidies and the market distortions, of which unfortunately there are still very many, but if you looked at the pure economics, the sorts of prices you can generate solar and wind for in Morocco or Egypt, I mean, it just, we're hopefully not very far away from signing a new project in Egypt at under $2.50 per kilowatt hour. So if you have market structures which disclose proper prices, that's the best signal by far. And then the other thing I think is a long-term direction of travel. We often say to governments, look, it goes back to my point about not doing just a 50 megawatt project and stopping there. We often say to governments, the most important thing you do is you set the long-term direction. Say, even saying we want to be net zero in 2050 or 2060 is enormously powerful.
Interesting.
Because it may not mean much for now in terms of actual tangible policy outcomes, but it gives the signal to everybody that this is the direction of travel. And we really are now in the cycle where that is the next the next asset life falls into that space. Yeah. So I think we often encourage people to start with where do you want to go with renewable energy? Do you want to have this much percentage by 2030 or 2035? And then you can build back from there. But having that overall signal that this is where a government wants to do is enormously important. So it's those two key elements, proper prices and a long-term strategy. Those are the key things.
And how would you, so take Poland as an example, right? How would you describe, so we know where the EU ETS price is, the carbon pricing is 40 euros. You presumably talk to utilities and other investors in the Polish market. How EU ETS aside, how would you has the tone of the conversation towards renewables and decarbonisation changed in the last 5 years? And is it about 2050 targets, EU ETS pricing? Is it just an awareness that the world is moving on? And then how does that impact your ability to invest?
Oh, I mean, in Poland and increasingly now in the rest of the European Union countries where we operate, the tone has changed massively in 5 years. I mean, it is night and day, to be frank. And what's driving that is it's a combination of things. It's renewables getting really, really cheap. Even if you had no movement on the carbon pricing side, you're still at highly competitive power. That's one thing. Second thing is that carbon has got expensive in the EU. Third is that you've got a body of EU legislation which embeds really challenging targets. I mean, we're pretty soon we're going to go to 55% emissions reduction, maybe even 60% if the Parliament has its way. We're at 32% for renewables by 2030, could go up to 38% in the course of this year. So you've got a whole body of EU legislation. I often think of EU legislation as a ratchet. It takes a very long time to sort of crank around to the next point on the cog, but it never goes back. Yeah. And that gives you a real sort of floor. And then you've got popular sentiment, more and more people concerned about the environment, pushing that agenda. And then you've got business. I mean, companies, and we see this outside the EU, company after company saying, I'm not waiting for government. I want to go green, whether it's because of, conviction that this is, conviction held by the management, whether it's because I can't recruit good people and keep them if I don't green, or whether it's because I'm worried that my purchases. Yeah. So there's just a sort of perfect storm pushing that way, and it makes investment much easier. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago we were doing nothing in Poland. Last year we did 4 or 5 projects. Hopefully similar this year, and I can feel the same. I mean, some momentum is absolutely there in Greece, and I can feel it coming in Bulgaria, Romania, the Balkans.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the reason I ask also is I've never seen I work in a bunch of different countries, but the change of tone from established players in Poland over the last 3 or 4 years, it was just it's like, Aurora, what are you talking about? Renewables getting built 4 years ago, get out of my office and stop wasting my time. And now it's just a complete conversion. Well,
I mean, last year we invested in a transition bond issued by Tauron, which is a coal-heavy utility in Poland.
State-owned coal-heavy, yeah.
If you had said 2 years ago, Ebrd, you will invest in a bond issued by Tauron in which they commit to reduce to close coal plants, reduce their emissions, and build more renewables, everyone would have just said, laughed and said, yeah. But and companies like that, which are very dynamic, very very ambitious, that they're the ones as well. It's not just the new developers coming in; it's the existing utilities who are really part of this transformation, and that's very exciting as well.
And there's a point, and then Peter, I want to ask you about this European ratchet, but part of it for me at least is the politics is actually decarbonisation isn't super expensive, or certainly at the moment it's not particularly expensive. Take your $40 coal example, but in general, we just got to a point politically where I think Poland, other Visegrad countries are just of the view that, hang on, is this really the fight I want to be taking to Brussels, or do I just do this and fight some other front? And it seems like there is, as much as we talk about the politics, actually there's a very fundamental kind of market-driven aspect here that it becomes pointless to oppose decarbonisation given what the cost is, particularly in low renewables penetration systems. Peter, can I maybe I don't know if you want to take the counterpoint to the kind of ratchet thing, but I mean, we have had waves in Europe of reversals, right? So we've had booms and busts, subsidies in Romania, subsidies in Croatia that, everyone gets excited and then everyone goes away again. Do you agree with Harry? This time it's different. This is an inexorable movement towards higher targets and more decarbonisation. And what's different if it is?
That's a good question, John. Curious if Harry would agree, but I see what happened in the early 2010s in Romania, Bulgaria, and actually across some other EU countries, where you had this kind of, let's try out renewable subsidies, and then maybe we're paying them way too much and they're quite expensive, and let's stop this experiment. Whereas now we're at a time where in a country like Romania, Bulgaria, you don't have an active renewable subsidy scheme. So let's say the investment in renewables is much more driven by retiring capacity. So the post-socialist countries that have still quite aging, especially thermal fleets. They're retiring, so there's need for new capacities. And then purely based on the economics, you see that renewables are very, very competitive. This gives you certainty that this time it is different because there's no one sitting behind it and saying yes or no to it, but it's the market that shows it.
Yeah, I suppose it's a similar point. It's the economics are very different now than they were a decade ago in terms of the cost. Peter, can you say a little bit about? So you've done a lot of work with Aurora in all sorts of Eastern European countries as well. Georgia, I think, going even further than Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. Does Aurora's role change, do you think, between sort of advising someone on investments in Germany and advising them on investments in Greece or something like that?
Yes, I would say yes. An important part is that policy is perceived as much less reliable, much more volatile, and that might or might not be true. But and thus market risks or understanding the market becomes much more important. And on the other hand, what we see is that more investors go into these markets because they say, it's not exciting to invest in German renewables under the subsidy scheme, or in France, everyone can do that. But I want to understand, and I want to have higher yields and also accept higher risks. So I think there's a much bigger need to understand the dynamics. There's one thing, as an example, we've been working on Romania. There's a big discussion in Romania about adding nuclear, and so far it seems unlikely that new nuclear plants, Cernavoda 3 and 4, are being built. And so as an investor, you can see this is a big challenge, or this is a big risk to my wind investment. If you play it with our, let's say if we simulate it, if we model it with our model, we see that actually for a wind investment, even with additional 1.5 gigawatts of nuclear in the system, prices are not affected that much. So it's a 1-2 euros per megawatt in revenues in capture prices. So understanding that makes you much more comfortable that you don't have to fear the decision of nuclear being introduced or not. And then I think on the other hand, it's also the way we work in these countries is we're in exchange with local players as well as international investors. And so there's also comfort of understanding the developments that are not always transparent for someone sitting in London or in Frankfurt.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Let's just say, were I investing in, I don't know, Vietnam or something like that, or PNG, would I rather have a great power model or have like the former minister as one of my advisors? I think I would much rather, the way I think about it is, in some markets that are like transparent, lots of data, you want a good power model. In ones that aren't, you want like someone with inside information or some sort of legitimate information. And it's interesting. So Vietnam, I would want that guy rather than the power model necessarily.
Yeah, that's not a business strategy Peter's going to condone.
I'm not saying you should. I'm saying
and I can also tell you that strategy has vulnerabilities as well.
Yeah, but it is interesting though that actually, because of the energy transition and because it's a physical system, actually there's a lot of the modeling that still matters. I had Tom Glover on from RWE recently, and he says, look, even in markets where there is no congestion charging, we need to know we're building in the right part of the grid or the wrong part of the grid. And even though, and though Germany's the same, right? Even if you're building in Germany and you're not going to get penalized today for congestion, you can't argue with physics. And 5 years time, 10 years time, if there's too much wind being produced at your node of the grid, you're going to be in trouble. And I suspect, as you say, it's the same for nuclear. It's the same for other things. You cannot, you're never going to get an ex-government advisor who knows what policy will look like in 10 years. Certainly the Polish guy from 5 years ago didn't know that. And so,
I agree with that completely. I mean, we did a massive solar project in Egypt a few years ago, which 1.5 gigawatts on one site, which really was the start of private renewables in Egypt. And Egypt's a fully regulated electricity sector. Very, very strong state involvement, state control. But even so, we built, we didn't do what you can do because we're not nearly as sophisticated, but we nonetheless built a sort of crude dispatch model of the Egyptian power sector, and we looked and tried and calculated, what is it? We built a merit order for the Egyptian power sector in order to understand where the renewable projects would sit in it. And every project we do, we look at the dispatch risk and the curtailment risk, because you're right. You can't argue with physics. You also, at the end, in the long run, you cannot argue with economics.
Yeah.
And these projects are all long-lived assets.
Yeah, interesting, and obviously reassuring for the CEO of a modeling company as well.
Yeah.
Although when we went into the US, we thought Texas much better than California because again, it's sort of investment by government decree in some ways. So it's not it's not a perfect system, but
Texas is perfect if you own a functioning winterized peaking capacity right now. You can retire for life off a few hours production.
Exactly. And anyway, there's a separate point, but I think Aurora had been saying for a while now that peaking capacity, although we never thought it would happen in winter, that was sort of unheard of. But anyway, that's a topic for a separate podcast. It's a good segue, Egypt, Harry, because I wanted to ask you a bit about Northern Africa, where I know you focus quite a lot. And I'm sure there's, a lot of heterogeneity across different countries and their sectors. But could you just describe a little bit for a power market expert? What is it? What are the Northern African power markets like? Are we talking about their price? Their prices. How do you think about investment there? Is it all state owned? Yeah. What are the characteristics?
Well, you're right. They're heterogeneous. We work in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. I'd say Morocco is probably at a different stage of development. There is a fair amount of private participation, and there's a degree of market liberalization for some of the larger consumers. But it's still large. There's a lot of state ownership and a lot of state intervention and a lot of price regulation. When you come to Tunisia and Egypt, it's essentially state owned, state controlled, fully regulated tariffs. Both countries have plans for market liberalization, but it's challenging. It takes a long time, and I think in a way renewables actually creates more of a problem for market liberalization, because these familiar issues that you've got zero marginal cost production coming onto the system actually sort of makes a bit of a mess of a market liberalization. So they're a long way from being sort of markets in any form that you would recognize.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And are there parallels to the early days of the EBRD? Is this like investing in
massively? Okay. The large degree of state involvement. Actually, also one fundamental feature is the sense of utilities as a sort of basic social right, rather than a commodity that should be priced and metered and so on. But all these countries, I'd say, especially in the last couple of years, Egypt have made real strides towards addressing those sorts of issues and making a transition. But these are big utilities, and it takes a while. So yeah, a lot of times it really feels like our transition model resonates there. Even if that transition model was designed essentially with the USSR in mind, it actually proves to be quite useful and quite applicable in those countries.
Yeah. No, and privatization is not in fact, I'm not even sure there's a trajectory towards privatization in power markets in general. There's a lot of the US markets are still vertically integrated, state owned. At least as I see it, I think, not in my own mind, I see all the virtues of privatization and prices, but I think the jury is still out in many markets. I wouldn't bet on any of them being, substantially privatized in Northern Africa, for example, 10 years from now.
Yeah, who knows? 10 years feels like a long way to predict anything these days. But it's not something that's on the cards in the foreseeable future. And I think if you're going to privatize, you need to have got to a certain point first. Premature privatization is clearly a mistake, and frankly, the post-Soviet era is littered with examples of that. I think what we've seen is, so there's privatization, then there's private participation. Clearly, private participation, especially in renewables, is almost a no-brainer. That's what drives these incredible prices. And then I think what we've seen is distribution privatization that does tend to work. If once you've got the right regulatory framework, and once you've got a handle on the asset base, then I think distribution privatization as a driver for investment and a driver for efficiency is a definite win.
You mean by distribution, you mean the lower voltage network?
Yeah, lower medium voltage. It's a customer facing business, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Do you think, just one thing on that, and Peter, maybe you have a view on this. It seems to me, at least, one of the drivers of liberalization of power markets has been, like Brussels and greater integration, right? And a sort of single market for power means that, people are adopting similar types of market structures, whether you're in Ireland or Poland, capacity mechanisms, those sorts of things. Could you see, Peter, that being a driver of reform, further south in Northern Africa, brought more integration with the European grid?
So interestingly, we've done some work with the Moroccan government in the past year. It's interesting, on the role of coal in the system, which is still fairly prominent considering how great the renewable resources are. And one of the big points there is that security of supply is a big concern. That has to do with the politics with the neighbors, etc. But there's also no integration, and let's say the link to Europe is relatively weak. There's a whole discussion about selling electricity without a carbon price into a market where people have to pay carbon prices. So Spain stopped that to some extent. So markets could be something that help the integration, yes, with Europe, but also, in the Moroccan example, probably relatively difficult, but a greater integration with its neighbors as well when you're thinking about security of supply and balancing. If you look at Europe, Germany couldn't have run its energy transition without relying on the neighbors. So yeah, that shows you that clearly.
Yeah, Morocco has a few hundred megawatt AC link to Spain, I think. Yeah. I hope Harry, are you looking at Morocco and hydrogen, green hydrogen, and these types of things? Is that presumably that could drive the linkage?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's probably more realistic. The energy integration will come more around. Well, put another way, the energy integration will come more around monetizing the incredible renewables potential. When you look at the numbers, I've been to this huge solar project we were closely involved in, Benban in Egypt, and you look at it on the map, and this is a 1.5 gigawatt site. You go there on the ground, and it's just, as far as the eye can see, it is empty, sunny desert. And you get the prices that you would expect when you've got such a great resource. And then, of course, you turn to the question of how do you monetize that? And do you monetize it by somehow shipping cheap, clean electricity to Europe, or do you monetize it by turning into green hydrogen? That's not clear, and the governments are starting to grapple with that. And Morocco certainly, has a clear agenda to really try to do something with hydrogen. What is that exactly? Is it strengthening the links and sending electricity? Is it exporting the hydrogen? Morocco's one of the world's largest phosphate producers, so maybe it's more about producing green fertilizer. So that definitely, Morocco is actively engaged in doing this, and we're one of the partners trying to help them think through what the opportunities are, what the challenges are. But to be fair, it's still fairly early stage.
I've got one more question, and it touches on something you said before about the difficulty in forecasting the future. But I'm going to ask you to forecast the future anyway. Let's just fast forward. I didn't touch on it. History of the EBRD was fall of the Iron Curtain and European development and those types of things. 10 years from now, what do you think will be the biggest difference between the EBRD of 2030 and the EBRD of 2020? Where do you think it's going? And Peter, I'll ask you the same thing. I'll just give Harry a minute to think about that, and then I'll ask you the same thing, Peter. So you've got a minute to think.
Thanks for the extra.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That is a good question, and I have no clue. Bear in mind, I joined the bank in 2005 when 30% of our business volume was in Russia. Egypt was a shareholder, but not a country of operation. And now, we're focused on Egypt, on Turkey. So it's, my prediction's almost guaranteed to be wrong. If I had to predict one thing, it's that we won't be talking about a green department, or I don't think my job will exist, because I don't think there will be a sort of separate green economy and climate action. I think, and this is an optimistic prediction, that those concerns will have become so part of, every investment decision that it won't make sense any more than we don't have a specific department that sort of looks for sound. We have a credit department, but that's for every transaction. It will be ingrained in everybody's mentality, and we won't be talking about it's 50% of our business green or 60% or 20% or whatever. It'll just be taken for granted. So I think it will not be possible to invest unless something is green and sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Peter.
All right.
It better be good.
Forecasts are always wrong, right? So in that sense, I mean, we, as Harry says, we're not running out of challenges. I think, and I mean, being a believer that the public lending and kind of this collaboration with the private sector makes sense. I think there's plenty to do. Industry decarbonization, net zero, all these challenges that maybe now we're talking about in Western Europe already, they will also make its way to other geographies. There's also something probably around standard setting. I mean, a lot of capital wants to go into, let's say, broadly the ESG space. Yeah. What does that mean? What's the real impact of an ESG investment? And I think that a bank like Ebrd can play a role as well in the future.
Yeah, interesting. And I totally agree. And even net zero 2050, I mean, it feels like we're going to have a foot on the accelerator for at least 2, maybe 3 decades from now. I feel, industry.
It's actually quite funny. I mean, I pulled up a graph recently looking at, energy consumption by sources. And it's quite shocking when you see how small renewables is. Yeah. We talk about it all the time. It's such an exciting story, but actually it's still pretty small. It was quite frightening. I mean, I was like, oh my God. Yeah, exactly. And the economics of investment in the first 20% is different to the economics of investment in the middle 50%, and is different from the last 10%. But then the saving grace is always the economics of investing in PV were terrible. Yeah. So you don't know. Economics can change.
So I hear the clock chiming in the background, Harry, which I think is telling us it's just about time to wrap up. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you about a few questions in the energy transition and whether you think they're over or underrated. So I've got 4 of them. Let me start with the first one. Policy risk as a driver of private sector investment or lending decisions. You often hear the private sector say, "Oh, we just need policy certainty." And sometimes politicians say, well, the world is changing and we need to adapt to that. So do you think policy uncertainty as a concept for investment deployment is overrated or underrated?
It's underrated when the technologies are cutting edge uneconomic. It's because you need it. Once you have the economics in place, as we were discussing earlier, policy is much less important.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
I'd say underrated.
Okay, good. 2, the role of markets in deeply decarbonizing the energy system. So I'm talking sort of 90% net zero. Harry, overrated or underrated?
Properly understood, accurately rated right now.
Okay. Peter?
I'd say underrated. I'm a firm believer in carbon prices.
Okay, good. 3, the role of gas as a transition fuel. Harry?
Too political.
Okay.
Very sensitive. Country by country answer.
Okay, good. Very diplomatic. Peter, what's the gas usage like in Papua New Guinea? Can you be less diplomatic here?
I'd say generally overrated, but in Papua New Guinea, I think the goal is net zero in the power sector in 2030. And fortunately, that seems to be much more achievable than in industrialized economies.
Okay, interesting. And then finally, Harry, the impact of ESG investing on the viability of fossil fuel projects. Is this drive towards ESG really impacting the economics of fossil fuel projects?
No, not yet.
Okay, so underrated. Peter?
Basically, not yet a big factor.
Great. Okay, well, excellent. I think that's a natural time to finish. So Harry, Peter, thanks so much for sharing your expertise.
Pleasure.
And it was a pleasure to speak. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
That was John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora, talking to Harry Boyd-Carpenter, Director, Head of Energy, EMEA at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and Peter Baum, Project Leader in Aurora's Berlin office, focusing on activities in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.